Hello, and welcome back to the fourth part of this Qt Design Studio tutorial series. Last time we finished the animation for our gauges, and we created our ISO safety icon panel here. Now, in this video we're going to bring in some JavaScript to simulate mock data and use it to drive our animated gauges and our readout displays. In order to do this, we first need to set up a few things. So let's start by bringing up a Finder window and navigate to our project, and here we're going to create a folder called Backend, and inside that folder we create another folder called Data, and it's important that this folder name is capitalized. And in this folder later on we're going to create a JavaScript file which creates the mock data and a QML file where we will specify the API of our user interface, and also to create some timers, which we'll do through the Qt Design Studio file wizard. First we need to make an adjustment to our project file. So let's come into this qml.project file, and here in the imports path we're going to add this backend folder that we just created to the import path, like so. And here we're going to choose a blank QML file, which is in the Qt Quick Files. We're going to give that the name values, again with a capitalized V, and we'll choose this backend folder that we created in the data folder to place this file. And there we see our values file in our data folder. So let's repeat that process and add a JavaScript file from here from the JavaScript menu. And we're going to call this one simulation.js. We're going to create that in the same data folder as our QML file. And finally, we need this special QML dir file. And we're just going to save this file as QML dir, and we'll save that in the data folder as well. Okay, so let's start by going into that values file we created and take a look at how we set this up. So I'm actually just going to copy and paste this across, and full disclosure, I'm not a software developer, so I'm not going to be writing complicated code in this tutorial or go too deep into it, and I don't expect that my code will be perfect, and it's enough for my purposes if I can use it for testing the design of my UI. With that out of the way, let's start. First thing we have is a Qt object with an ID of values, and then we have an int property called RPM, and this is going to control the position of the timeline that we created in the tachometer component, and a string called display RPM to control the numeric readout of our display. Now we can give these a default value, so let's do that. We're going to set the RPM dial to a specific frame number. And we'll give the string a test value of foo. So let's save the file, and before we go back into design mode, we're just going to go into the JavaScript file and delete everything here to start with. And we'll go back into our design mode here. And if we take a look down here at our tachometer component and think back, remember that we already published this RPM frame here, and we need to do the same for the readout display. So let's go back into our component. We're going to select text item, and we're going to click on the nut next to the text input field and set this property as an alias. And then we'll go to the root item of our component, find this property, and we're going to rename it to something like display RPM. Okay. We're going to fix this text object. So what we want to do to start with is just make sure that everything stays centered in our text object while the number's changing. So let's drag out the text box to fill up our button, our background. And then we're just going to center it up with the alignment here. And one thing to note is that I am using a fixed width font, otherwise the numbers would jump around in their position with every new frame. So with a fixed width font, we know that we're going to have a nice smooth animation. Okay, so now this is ready for the next stage. Let's go back up to our main file. And if we select our RPM dial, we see we have our two properties, the display RPM and the RPM frame. And now we just need to create a binding so that the values displayed here are the ones passed through from our QML file. But before we do that, we need to import our data, and we do that with this import statement here. Okay, so with the component selected, we're going to come in and set the binding. And we're just going to set this to data dot values. You see there it's auto completing dot RPM. And now you see this icon here has changed to indicate that we have a binding in place. So let's do the same with this one. And this one is data dot values dot display RPM. Okay, and this means at the moment that it isn't actually getting that value from the backend. Now, in order to solve this, what we might need to do is just close the project. And open it back up again. And now when we come back into our main file, we can see that it's picked up the variables, the default values that we set for our variables in the QML file. And we can test this is actually working by going back into the backend. And just changing these values. And we should see in our main file now that the values have updated. There we go. So now we know that's working. Okay, so now we need to go back into our QML file and we're going to add a timer that we want to use to generate a number range we can animate our gauge with. So let's come back in to the QML file. And again, I'm just going to copy and paste this across. So let's grab this timer object here. And paste that here. Okay, and it's just a timer called timer that's running, that repeats. And it's linked to our JavaScript simulation, and I'll show you that code in a minute. So let's copy and paste this back across. And inside our JavaScript, we need a set of variables for the gauge. We have the RPM needle count and the readout count, And we have a couple of internal variables that we use here for the max RPM and the idle RPM, which acts a bit like a floor for our gauge that stops it from going all the way back to 0. And we also need a bool here to tell the timer whether it should be counting up or down. So here we have a function that just passes this internal RPM needle count to the RPM value of our QML file, and this does the same with a string for our display RPM. So here I'm actually using a rounding, and then I concatenate that with 2 zeros, and this is because when I was testing this file, I found that the end digits were animating so fast that you could see all of them on screen all the time. So I just do it this way so it looks better in the UI. And then in our main loop, we just have a timer that simply counts up and down within our set ranges and updates the value in our QML file. So if we go back now into our main file, and run the live preview, we should see the animation for our gauge. And there you see, we have our first animation being controlled by our mock data simulation. Okay, great. So we're going to repeat that process for the next 2 gauges. We're going to do the speedometer last. We're going to start with this, and then if we have time, we'll also go in and hook up our ISO icons so they're also activated by our mock data. Let's just reset these default variables. And then we'll get started on the fuel gauge. We're going to repeat the process again here, so we'll start by setting up this text item. We'll export the property, and we'll do the same with this one. We'll rename these properties. And then we'll adjust this text item here the same way that we did the others. So we're just going to drag out the object so it fills our button, our background, center it up with the alignment, repeat the process with the one underneath. Come back up to our main file, and we're going to add in what we need for this. And I'm just going to copy and paste everything across. So we need the variables. We'll give these a set of default values. We'll come back into our main file. We might need to reset the code model, and then we can come in and set these bindings. So the first one is data.values.liters. And there we see that one's now has the correct binding. And this is data.values.display liters. And that's that one there. And then for the range value underneath, that's data.values.display range. Okay. And actually I added one too many zeros to my default, so let's go back in quickly, change that, and we should see now in our design we now have the correct default values in place. Okay, so I'm just going to copy and paste the timer across, and this is just a duplicate of our original timer, but for our fuel gauge instead of the tachometer. So we have our timer, works exactly the same as the one before. And for the JavaScript, I've just copied everything across. So now with all that set up, let's run the live preview. And we see here that it's actually running, but it's very, very slow. Which is probably how it would be, even slower in the real one. But for our sake, we want to be able to preview our animations a little bit faster than this. So we're just going to come in and adjust the interval on this timer, and that's going to make this animation a lot faster. Now if I run the live preview, okay, great, now we see this is actually moving a lot faster. So I'm just going to speed up the live preview a little bit so that we get to the end of the fuel gauge and see what happens there. Okay, and here we are. And here we see it enters the warning stage, so we have our pulsing dial effect as well. And then you can see here when it gets to the very end of the fuel dial, it simply resets itself to the beginning. So there we are, and that animation starts from the beginning again. Okay, so let's repeat the process for the speed dial. We're going to do this a little bit differently. We're actually going to use a real number, so a floating point number, with our 200 frame range for the timeline, and we'll talk about this as we go. So first, we're going to export the text property, and the same for this one. Go to the root item of our component and rename these properties. And then we're going to scale our text object and center up the text inside it with the alignment here. Repeat that process for the one underneath. Then we'll come back up and select our speed dial. And we're going to set these bindings. So first we need our variables for our QML file. We'll paste those in there. And we're going to change this to a real number, and rather than using an integer. We'll set some defaults. We'll come back to our main file, and now we can set up the bindings for this component. So select it, reset our code model to make sure that these variables are available, and we'll set the bindings in the same way that we did the others. So let's set this first one, data.values .kph. Data.values .display kph. And finally, data.values.display kpl. Okay, great. So let's just go back in here and grab the parts of the JavaScript that we need. We'll grab all the variables for the speedometer. And paste those across. We have here a max and min, and we have a readout count for the range. And we need this second bool for the timer for the speedometer that tells it whether it's going forwards or backwards. We'll paste that across. And we need these functions that update our values in our QML file. And paste those in there. And finally, we need this timer function for the speedometer. So let's copy this. And we'll paste that into place here. We don't need this one yet. Okay. And here, instead of just adding a plus plus, so adding a single integer, we're actually adding a very small increment to match up with our real number here. So let's go back into our main file. Go to the speed dial, we see everything's set up ready to go. We'll come in quickly, have a look. And as you remember, this is only a 200 frame timeline, and you can see here the gaps between the integers are quite large. So if we were using integers here, it would be quite a choppy animation. But because we're using a real number instead, when we run this, we should see that it's a nice smooth animation. So first, let's just reset the code model, make sure that everything is updated and available for us, and then we'll run the live preview. And nothing happens. And the reason for that is that we forgot to add our timer into the QML file. So we'll go back into our code here, into this QML one, and let's just grab the timer. And then we'll copy and paste this timer into our values.qml file. And now when we go back into our main artwork and run the live preview, we should see some animation. Okay, so now it is animating, but it's animating very slowly at the moment. But you can really see here how smooth the animation is, even though there's only a small amount of frames for that timeline. All right, let's just speed it up. We can just drop this interval down to 10, or maybe even 20. And now when we run our live preview, there we go, that's much better. So we can see here, all of our gauges are being driven now by the mock data. The speedometer is running very smooth, using a real floating point number. Updating all of our displays and triggering all of our animations. Okay, so I wanted to hook up the ISO icons, but I think we've run out of time for this video. And actually what I'm going to do is fix some of this stuff off screen, and then we're going to discuss it when we come back in the next video. Okay, so I think that's a good place to stop for today. When we come back next time, we're going to take a look at those final bits of the code, and then we're going to start work on our boot up animation. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.